The speakers are Nicola O'Brien, Riley J. Taylor, Liz Tyson, and Blaine Abercrombie, who are 4 authors of the volume Teaching Liberation, and they will share their experiences and methods on communicating and advocating for animal and human liberation through education in a variety of contexts. The panel will be hosted by Agnes Trzak, who is the editor of Teaching Liberation. And Agnes Trzak is a founder of WINT Star, an anti-speciesist collective run for and by vegan people experiencing misogyny and gender discrimination. And she works as an integration educator with primary school students and published literature and interviews on total liberation and the overlap of speciesism with forms of human oppression. And Nicola O'Brien is the communication manager of Freedom for Animals. She has been active in anti-captivity campaigning for over a decade, and today shares her work on debunking commonly accepted truth about zoos. And then we have Riley J. Taylor, is a key worker and social justice activist who will provide an intimate look into her work accompanying autistic youth in their school lives. Riley tells us about the effects poverty and disability have upon her students' freedom of choice and autonomy. And Liz Tyson has a doctorate in animal law, and as an animal advocate with our over 16 years of experience, Liz works with various animal protection and conservation NGOs, and she is now the director of Born Free USA Primate Sanctuary. And then we have Blaine Abercrombie, and he is a sports researcher and will give us an insight into the learning and teaching of hard science, as well as an analysis of bodybuilding culture and the toxic masculinity and carnism, and it is connected and how it is connected to by applying applying feminist critique of gendered food habits. Sorry for that. So welcome all, welcome Blaine Abercrombie, Nicola O'Brien, Riley J. Taylor, Agnes Trzak, and Liz Tyson. So enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Corinna, for this nice introduction. I'm Agnes Trzak. My pronouns are she and her. And I will give you a little kind of overview of the book, because we only are 5 people today, but there's actually 18 of us who published the project together with Lantern Books last year. The idea behind the book had kind of 2 reasons. The first reason was to make animals relevant in education, really. So we all know the dire state that the planet is in. Climate change gets a lot of mention, but animals are still kind of the forgotten identity that we have not approached yet, speaking about anti-oppression and liberation politics. So anti-speciesism must be addressed, and this is kind of the urgent appeal that we are writing on in this book. Secondly, I think many of us attending this conference can very much empathize with the personal kind of urgency that this book had for me as the editor, because I noticed working in education or working any job really, I found myself often being the only vegan, and it can be a very isolating experience. And especially if you are quite vocal about it, and if you want to include an anti-speciesist politics in everything you do. So I noticed myself, and I think the other authors in this book as well, that there are many obstacles, and we face kind of loneliness and often hopelessness when we come into this, when veganism comes into discussion at our places of work and specifically in the education sector. The ubiquity of speciesist violence is not something that we can just leave behind, that we can just shut out when we work with people that we communicate on a daily basis with, and this often ends in kind of a questioning of us as people, of our choices. It can end in harassment and bullying even, which is a very horrible experience that none of us should be facing. So this book was kind of an attempt at networking, at getting us together, at giving us a platform to connect and to notice, oh, actually there are people who are in the same boat, who are also trying their best. And this is kind of one of the results. Today's conference talk is one of the results of this networking project. And before I let all these lovely people tell you a bit more about their chapters, about the work that they have contributed to this book, I wanted to say that we have talked a lot about sorry, I'm a bit nervous. We've talked a lot about what education is. What does it mean to educate, to work in education, to be an educator? And we all kind of agree that it is not just this idea of transferring knowledge, of saying, I don't know, this is so because of something. Sorry. I mean, many of us can just kind of type a question into a search engine or sign up to an online course, and we get the knowledge that we are craving, and we can learn what we are desiring to learn. And the idea of education then becomes far more interpersonal. It becomes an encounter where two people meet each other and learn from each other. I think this is the important part, that we don't kind of come into an encounter leaving our whole person, our beliefs, our opinions, our personality behind. We don't kind of leave it at the door like a coat, for example. We don't strip ourselves of our essence. And this is the idea that when we come into a situation, which doesn't necessarily have to be in a classroom, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a school, it can be at the dinner table with the family, it can be a really important campaign that we are running, it can be an encounter with a stranger. These are moments of education where we have the possibility to create a space. And I think this space, in the form of this Teaching Liberation book, was created by really a variety of people, and the topics that we are discussing today seem all very kind of isolated. We'll be talking about masculinity, we'll be talking about Riley's schoolwork, we'll be talking about Nick's and Liz's campaign work and research, and it's very kind of dispersed, but I think the red thread that runs through all of this is that we are coming together, and we would like to express the urgency behind making animals a topic in any sort of encounter that can lead to creating a space that allows for people to discover an anti-oppressive politics for themselves. Let me just check my notes quickly. I see I have 1 minute left. So maybe just as a kind of last sentiment that I can pass on is that we all try our best as a group in Teaching Liberation, but also in our activism, to be kind, not just to the people that we educate, so to speak, but also to ourselves. And I think this is something that the book conveys a lot, and that I am actually very grateful for to each speaker today and every contributor to the book, that you really have this in yourselves and that you convey it to the world. Thanks. I'll pass on to Riley J. Taylor now, and later we'll have the Q&As.
That's great. Thanks, Aga. So my name is Riley Taylor, and my pronouns are she, her. my kind of for fun job is that I am the assistant director of Out for Blood Film Festival, which is a queer horror film festival based in Cambridge in the UK. But for my day job, I work in an autism provision in a mainstream secondary school. And my chapter in Teaching Liberation is called Including an Anti-Speciesist Practice in My Work with Neurodiverse Youth. Today, I'm going to be talking about some strategies that I use at work. So although almost every student that I work with has a diagnosis of autism, some of the students I work with also have diagnosis of ADHD, dyslexia, and other kind of related conditions. And my role is to support them inside the classroom in their everyday lessons. So as a neurotypical person, I was initially considered talking about working with young people in general, because I was really worried that I didn't want to be talking for my students or talking to an experience that I actually have never had. But I think it's really important that we, or any neurotypical people who are involved in the animal liberation movement as activists and organisers or educators, it's really important that we are recognising that there are people in our movement who are autistic or that are vegans, that are activists, or maybe want to get involved in the work that we're doing. And we need to reflect this in the activism and the demonstrations that we're doing to make sure that we are making accessible spaces for everybody. So for those of you who maybe don't know very much about autism, autism is a neurological condition. It's a spectrum condition. So people who are autistic are all completely individual, have different experiences, and autism will affect how they see and interact with the world around them, including differences in communication, sensory processing, and emotional regulation. And I really hope I'm talking about my role in a sensitive way, because so many autistic people and the young people that I work with often have decisions made for them that kind of impacts their choices and has an impact on their autonomy in, just for example, the food that they eat, the way that maybe the clothes that are bought for them. Parents and carers often for young people will be doing the shopping, will have some sort of control over the money that gets kind of spent in the household, which often means that young people don't get to choose maybe what they are consuming, how that relates to their ethics and their moral values. And parents and teachers in general will kind of have a set of rules that students are expected to follow and to listen to. So as part of my job, it's really important to me that I am working with my students to encourage their own critical thinking, and kind of how do I do that in a world that is kind of set up to have very specific rules around why it's normal to use animals for human needs, or why it's normal for certain people to have access to certain spaces. So how do we as educators encourage our young people that we work with, or anyone that we work with, to feel some sense of autonomy about what their own critical thinking? And hopefully my work kind of reflects the shared experiences that I have with the students I work with, because they're teaching me every single day as well. It's not, teaching isn't just a one-way street. I'm not just imparting things that I'm aware of, they're teaching me as well. I think that goes for everyone that works in some sort of educational role. So it's also kind of important to point out that the school that I work in is predominantly, it's in a very white area. Most of the area is quite middle class as well. And it is important to note that there is a racial bias in autism diagnosis. As well as that, a lot of the students that I work with come from poorer families, and all of these all of these things kind of have an impact on the support that they get while they're young people, and ultimately the choices that are available to them while they're in school. So for example, some students that I work with are entitled to free school meals, which is registered on a daily allowance. So the food that they can choose to eat is restricted. The students who might have kind of sensory needs or sensory differences, sometimes certain foods might feel or smell or taste uncomfortable or sometimes even repulsive. And that kind of restricts even further their food choices that are available to them. If you add on top of that, what food is there that doesn't have animal products in, what doesn't have flesh and milk and eggs in, there's usually few or mostly no choices left available for them to eat. So part of my role is that I will ask for food choices to be widened to make sure that there's food available for all the students. Young people may not feel comfortable with asking, or may not realize that they can say, there's nothing available here for me, how can we change this? But as an adult, we can kind of use our position of privilege in the school, or in every kind of event, any way that we run. We can use that to work with students and young people to support them in advocating for more options. So I don't mean I would say for them, I think we need to do this. I would support them in how we could go about making a plan for who to talk to, what kind of things we might want to encourage them to include. And actually, since I wrote my chapter, there is now vegan food available every single day in the school that I work in. And it seems small, but this is pretty big for us. And this is all down to an environmental group that was set up with staff and with students, and they work together to ensure that there's environmentally friendly food choices, that there are recycling stations, and that there are kind of more, we think about our energy consumption as a school. And this isn't just staff, we encourage the students to lead this. We also encourage them to try vegan food, because a lot of my students have never tried vegan food before, or at least they think they haven't, but they don't realize that a lot of the food that they already eat is vegan. So all of my students will have cooking lessons on their timetable. We can cook in our department, and we work together to kind of build like a menu and recipes of food that we can eat and we can all share together, which is really, really lovely. Usually I'll wait for them to bring up veganism, because I think it's important that they feel in control of the conversation. But sometimes the most successful interactions that I have with students are around companion animals, because nearly every student I work with has a pet, and they have great relationships with the animals that live with them. So this opens up a space for us to talk about, why are dogs seen as part of the family, but pigs are seen as flesh to be consumed and eaten, when both are just as smart as each other? Does it make sense? I mean, not really, but a lot of people have never thought about this before. So this is really nice that we can start challenging some of these misconceptions about animals. One area that I find particularly challenging in school is that we do trips a lot of the time to places that have animals in cages, like zoos. And up until kind of this year, really, I found it quite difficult to challenge why we do that. And actually, this kind of leads me on really nicely to talking to Nicola and Liz, because their chapter, What Zoos Teach Us, has some incredible information about discussion points about why zoos are zoos okay? I mean, no, they're definitely not. But I needed the language to be able to say this is why, and that is what Nicola and Liz have given to me, so I'm very grateful to that. So I'm going to pass over to them now. Thank you very much for listening to me talking, and yeah, I look forward to hearing from Liz and Nicola.
Thank you so much, Riley and Aga. That was awesome. What a great introduction. I'm Liz. My pronouns are she, her. I'm going to dive right in because we have a lot to get through. So, zoos claim to be the best, and in some cases, the only true way for people, and particularly children, to learn about animals. They claim to empower future conservationists with their inspiring educational work, and they claim to be a bastion for saving species from extinction. With these lofty claims in mind, I carried out a zoo visit some years ago, something that I do regularly to be sure I remain informed on the issue. Trying to put myself in the shoes of someone visiting a zoo for pleasure and perhaps for the first time, I wanted to see what information I would take away with me. So during my trip to the zoo, I saw a gibbon sitting on the ground in a barren enclosure. I saw a capuchin monkey violently head twisting as he paced around his cage. I saw flamingos standing stock still in their open top enclosure, not flying away. Had I taken lessons away from this based on looking at the animals and the way they were living, I could have easily concluded that gibbons were solitary terrestrial dwelling animals. In fact, they live in small family groups and are arboreal, spending most of their life in the trees. I would have thought capuchin monkeys do strange dance-like movements with regularity. In fact, what I was seeing was a stress-related behavior linked directly to the monkey's confinement. I would have thought flamingos were flightless birds. They are not. These birds have had half of one wing amputated without anaesthetic when they were babies to prevent them from escaping. What I know about all of these animals I saw at the zoo, I learnt from sources other than that zoo, and simply looking at them in the zoo gave me little more information in their size and shape. Perhaps the most important lesson I took away from that day was at the chimp house. In her small glass-walled room, a chimp was rocking backwards and forwards obsessively in a hammock and carrying out a behaviour known as regurgitation and reingestion. R&R as it's abbreviated to. It's a stress-related behaviour known as a stereotypy, commonly seen in zoo-housed chimps, and is a signal of mental distress. Stereotypical behaviours are common amongst captive wild animals, but not seen in free-living populations. As I was watching this distressed ape, a woman and a young child came and stood close to me. They remained by the exhibit for little more than 10 seconds, and the woman turned to the child and said, "Look at the funny monkey playing on the swing." They both laughed at what they thought was a sweet scene and then walked away. So even when we see animals in zoos, we don't listen to what they're telling us. We don't really see them.
And when we look for formal evidence of any positive educational impacts of zoos, it's perhaps not surprising, given what Liz has just described, that it's really hard to come by. There was one study published in 2014, which was looking at the learning outcomes for children who visited London Zoo. And out of 2,800 pupils, only 38% of them were able to demonstrate a positive learning outcome from their trip to the zoo. The rest were shown to have no change in learning, or worse, experienced negative learning. And despite zoos making big claims that they inspire children to become proactive conservationists, the study also found that the impact on children's belief in their ability to be able to do something about conservation was seen as weak. And this is really worrying when we consider that in places like Western Europe, most schools take children to visit zoos as part of educational trips. And a wider public survey on the general public perception of zoos was carried out in 2017 by a travel company called Responsible Travel, which was supported by Born Free. And the results showed what we see at our work through zoo campaigning, that the public are misled over the conservation work of zoos. So in response to this survey, over 3/4 of respondents estimated that at least 1/5 or more of the animals kept captive in zoos would be endangered species, which is actually far, far higher than the reality. Numerous studies, including ones carried out by our organisations, have shown that the vast majority of animals in zoos are not endangered. And only about 5% of species held in zoos in England and Wales are classed as endangered, and 17% as threatened in the wild. Well, most zoos hold meerkats captive. It's really common to see that in a zoo collection. Yet they are classed as least concern from a conservation perspective. So why are they held in the zoo if that is the aim of zoos, to conserve species? It's likely it's because they're popular animals. They're small, they're cute, they're furry. They've also been popularised through TV documentaries and a series of TV adverts. So people just enjoy seeing them. Yet many less charismatic species which are endangered and they are actually in urgent need of conservation intervention are not as widely present in zoos, such as many insect species, probably because they're not as popular with visitors as seeing animals like meerkats or elephants or orangutans, for example. And there is a zoo trade body in the UK called BIARSA, and they have this claim about what zoos do. They say, by visiting BIARSA zoos and aquariums, you are helping to safeguard the future of vulnerable, threatened and endangered species. But this suggestion that the zoo's breeding of animals will actually protect them from extinction in the wild is simply not based on evidence. Few, if any, animals are actually introduced into the wild as a result of zoo breeding programs. So from these few examples, we feel it's clear that zoos are teaching a confusing conservation message at best.
Mm-hmm. And we don't just receive misleading lessons from zoos about the animals themselves and their conservation status. Zoos also perpetuate colonialist, reductive, and at times downright racist viewpoints in relation to the role of local and indigenous people in conservation efforts. A good example of this can be found at London Zoo. On the side of the pygmy hippo enclosure is a brightly coloured sign entitled "Check in with the Chief." The sign purportedly sets out what they call important steps for successful field work. They tell them that budding hippo conservationists how they can engage with local communities, and the sign reads as follows. Step 1, arrive in the forest village, head straight for a chat with the chief. Step 2, slip chief a small gift to move things in the right direction. Step 3, the chief bangs his drum to summon villagers to his house. Step 4, introduce London Zoo and our mission, ask for assistance. Step 5, if the chief says yes, we can ask villagers if they've seen fresh hippo tracks and employ guides to lead us to the spots. The guides know the forest paths like London taxi drivers know London. In just 5 short sentences, the local people in the Western African communities that pygmy hippos are native to have been fetishized to the image of the primitivized chief banging his drum to call villagers. They've been tarred with the implication of only responding to conservation concerns if paid or bribed with gifts. And if the chief agrees to London Zoo's mission, noting that there's no suggestion of discussing local conservation needs or input requested from the local people, then villagers can be employed as guides for the, quote, conservation scientists. There's no suggestion that local people are equipped to play any other role than the equivalent of the taxi driver in this project. The zoo's educational pack, which is what it uses to teach young children about conservation, further entrenches the racist stereotypes. Without exception, local people are presented as primitive, uninterested in conservation for conservation's sake, motivated by money, lazy, unknowledgeable, and poor. The conservation scientists from the zoo, on the other hand, are portrayed as motivated by their passion for conserving this unique animal. The local people need to be educated about the importance of the pygmy hippos by the conservation scientists. Of course, the purpose of this narrative is not to educate thoughtfully and respectfully about the realities and complexities of human-wildlife conflict, something which takes time, effort, research, and active engagement with local people to understand in any meaningful way. The purpose of these reductive narratives serve to position the zoo as the saviour who needs to either educate the ignorant but generally kind local people in the form of villagers, or save animals from the greed of the bad local people in the form of poachers.
And this saviour position of the zoo, of course, also extends to the animals that they're holding captive, and we believe presents a message of human dominion over other animals. I mean, the very institute of a zoo exists to hold animals captive against their will because we as humans have deemed it necessary, even if there's no direct benefit to those individuals. And this teaches visitors that we have an authority to make all decisions on behalf of other animals. In fact, like, we must be the ones to make the decisions because we know better. Animals in zoos have all their choices removed from them. They eat when they're given food. They spend their lives confined in spaces determined by their captors. Who's they're going to share that space with is determined by their captors. And they're even designated who they're going to mate with. Tian Tian and Yang Guan were 2 pandas that were held captive at Edinburgh Zoo, and they failed to mate through choice for the first year. So for the next 3 years, Tian Tian was artificially inseminated using sperm from Yang Guan and another panda. And research has shown that, like most mammals, pandas have a preference when it comes to choosing their mate. Yet the zoo repeatedly artificially inseminated her, which is not only a physical violation, but it's also a complete disregard for that very little bit of autonomy that Tian had, which was, did she want to mate and who was she going to mate with? Most of us have visited zoos in our lifetime, often as children, and therefore to many in society, zoo is just a place where wild animals live. This narrative of animals live in zoos and zookeepers look after animals is especially prevalent with children in their games, their toys, their books. And the animals are often referred to as zoo animals, which defines them by their exploitation rather than their individuality. It's as though they belong there, that's where those animals should be. And this image is so completely normalized that to question that, to ask whether the animal should be there, is seen as an extreme position to take. So that's why we believe it's crucial that in our wider work as a movement for animal liberation, we must include anti-zoo, anti-aquarium and general anti-captivity work to tackle this normalised position and this relationship of our dominion over other animals. Yet, sadly, this issue is not given as much space in the movement. And we feel that if we're just focusing our efforts so heavily on creating dietary vegans, but we don't teach this wider animal liberation message, then animals will continue to suffer for many years to come in these institutions. In our work, we often come across vegans who support zoos, and they believe that that is in line with their veganism because they love animals and they believe that these zoos are looking after them. So we just want to press that point. And again, just that overall wider anti-oppression work that needs to come into our movement in so many different ways. And that leads me on to Brien, who's going to talk now about another crucial topic.
Hi there. So first and foremost, my name is Brien Abercrombie. My pronouns are he and him. Thanks very much to Aga, Liz, Nicola and Riley for everything you've said, all the introductions, all the brilliant words. So I'll just quickly share my screen. I'm going to go through a short presentation as sort of foundation to my talk today. So my intention today is to talk of my experiences of conducting my research, engaging in teaching and the pedagogical process involved in that, and seeking to impact the knowledge transfer between myself, my students, and further into the communities that both exist within. So first and foremost, a bit about me. I am an early career researcher and part-time lecturer who is also a PhD candidate. I'm working within a university department which is currently made up of both science and sport combined, and I'll come on to some of the issues that combination brings along with it later on in my presentation. I'm currently conducting ethnographic research within the bodybuilding community in central Scotland, exploring ways in which gender, veganism and sport intertwine and interlink and inform each other. So as I said, today I'm going to talk about my own experiences, but I hope that people can sort of gain some insight, something valuable that they can take back into their own often very different fields. So just over 10 years ago, Men's Health magazine, which at the point of publishing this edition had a readership of over 4 million people per issue. This edition of the magazine condemned plant-based diets for being biologically unsustainable. But more interestingly to me, and something that has informed my research moving forward, they said that it wasn't manly enough to consume a plant-based diet. This was something that sparked my interest in how meat consumption and masculinities overlapped, and as I said, actually informed each other. As I'm sure most people watching this who have ever considered meat and masculinities interacting with each other will know that meat, primarily red meats, in particular beef, have long been associated with masculinities across the world. As such, we've ended up in a position where meat-based diets have been deemed to be more appropriately consumed by men. And thus, this perpetuates the opposition of men and women's food, meat and vegetables, and meat versus tofu when it comes to diets. Interestingly though, something else which is placed in opposition in my experiences in my research is that of men's gym activity and men's physical activity being placed in opposition to that of women's. And by extension, you have a position where men's physical well-being and wellness and health is placed in opposition to that of women. So in my research, I sort of spend a lot of time at 4 different bodybuilding gyms in central Scotland and collectivise them. Now, something which is interesting is that a number of those gyms have an outright ban on women members. Okay. Other ones have 1 or 2 women members, but they are, when in that space, forced to work out in what is known colloquially in the west of Scotland as the bird's bit. Okay, the women's section of the gym where the walls are painted pink and the wall is also sort of branded with CrossFit branding. Okay, one of the things which then comes out of that is that this is a real men's gym, and that's been said to me by numerous participants in my research. This is a real men's gym because women don't come here. One of the most interesting developments of my research was the inversion of the definitional literal absence that Carol Adams talks about in The Sexual Politics of Meat to the present referent, which Kelly Struthers-Montfort talks about. That's the most significant indication of the explicit pursuit of domination by the men involved. Jacob, a 27-year-old elite level bodybuilder from the west of Scotland, said to me in an interview that you can get protein from a lot of food, but he still prefers his to have a smile at one point. So from that, we can deduce that, not content with oppressing all other human animals, men as a collective within that environment strive to broaden their domination to that of all other living beings, including non-human animals. So my experiences, as someone who, as I said earlier on, works within a department consisting of science and sport disciplines, the methodologies used, the most dominant methodologies used are that of lab-based, quantitative investigations looking at hard sciences. Okay, hard sciences. So this often results in a situation where qualitative research like my own is often downplayed in terms of legitimacy and accuracy, reliability. And because of that, the conclusions that I often draw and people around me draw are assumed to be unquantifiable and therefore not valid. Unfortunately, looking to disrupt that hypermasculinity and myths around bodybuilding and meat consumption is a challenge in and of itself. And Agnes touched on that in the introduction. So, however, just as bodybuilders are infatuated with the perfect male body, academia and the academy as a whole is passionate when it comes to its own masculinisms, especially in disciplines like sports and sports science, where I do the sort of majority of my work. Simultaneously, and perhaps sort of paradoxically to that statement, there is an element and a culture of enlightened sexism that exists within academia. So by that I mean, it means that it can be beneficial for men working in academia to be viewed as a pro-feminist man. But in actual fact, their actions often fall short of that supportive narrative and language that they create within their research. So the gendered nature of the dominant culture, where hard and soft sciences are binarised and placed in opposition to each other, leads us to a position where the narrative is that real men do real science. So how do I go about including liberation in my teaching within an area of research which is so heavily focused on steering everyone away from those discussions? So unfortunately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, my undergraduate sports students, sort of early in their academic journey, have little interest in learning about veganism through an explicitly feminist lens as a starting point. Now, that as a starting point is quite important. Okay. However, there is scope to develop an interest based on discussions of potential health benefits of a plant-based diet. Because when I lead discussions or have discussions with my students on this, I try to move the discussion towards things like performance benefits of vegan diets rather than any ethical or environmental considerations. Now, I do this for a number of reasons, but one of them is to try and to maintain interest while still underpinning and informing all of my teachings with liberation theory. I feel similar to something that Riley mentioned earlier on, that I feel as if allowing my students to approach discussions of veganism in their own way, in their own manner, I hope that it has more of a permanent impact on their lives at a later date when I do look to bring in and introduce vegan feminist theory and literature. Because that's what I'm seeking to try and do, is make that permanent impact. Because as educators, it is our responsibility to expose the injustices that we perceive and actively work against them so that our students won't and don't perpetuate the same systems that we're all a part of at this moment in time. Thank you all for your time. My email address is there if anyone has any questions. I will be in the Q&A after this. And thank you all, and thank you very much to the organisers of the conference and to those who contributed to the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your work with us and giving us insight in all those interesting topics where I think somehow interconnected in a way. Yeah, so I think we have some questions already. Let me just start it. There's one question for Brien. Have you seen some shift in interest or awareness amongst your students since documentaries like The Game Changers have been released?
Yeah, so one thing that I found quite interesting on the back of things like The Game Changers being released and also on the back of sort of high level, elite level athletes coming out and saying that they actually follow a plant-based diet, is that it sparks an element of interest at the beginning, but then those who sort of show an interest at the start then go out and find things calling into question the legitimacy of that plant-based diet. So an example of that would be there's a mixed martial arts athlete called Nate Diaz who came out and said that he was a vegan, and immediately everyone began thinking, oh, this means that people can follow a vegan diet and be an elite level athlete. However, on the back of it, I had discussions with my students, and at the start, quite a few people in the class were interested in the legitimacy, the sort of sustainability of a vegan diet. But by the end, a lot of them had went out and found sort of what I call bro science or sort of pseudoscience, which informs them that actually they can't get the protein that is necessary for them to sustain a high level athletic career without eating the flesh of other animals. So it's the old thing, sort of confirmation bias. They will go out and find the thing which often makes their life as easy as possible. There has been an upsurge in discussion about about vegan and plant-based diets on the back of the Game Changers, but I don't think it was as big as a lot of people in sort of my area had hoped. But yeah, I would say there has been an upsurge in discussion about vegan diets within sports and elite level sports overall.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question for Riley. How do you address people who take over other people's decisions and thus oppress them? And how do you encourage your students to express their own choices and develop and stand up for their values? So it's actually two questions.
Yeah, thanks. So a lot of my work is kind of, we would look at maybe what the student wants, what their kind of goals are, what they want to do maybe for their subjects when they leave school and things like that. And I also work very closely with their parents. So if their parents are maybe trying to encourage them in a direction the student doesn't want to go in, I act as a facilitator in encouraging kind of parents and carers and the other teachers around them to listen to the student and what the student wants to say. And sometimes if my student, any of the students I work with find that overwhelming, we might come up with a plan, write a letter. Yeah, we'll find other ways around it rather than just sitting down all together and talking about it, because that can be quite scary. So hopefully we can build strategies together that they can then use once they've left school as well, I hope. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure if I got the second part in there as well.
Yeah, I think that was very good. Thank you. Then there's a question for Nicola. How do you address people about the misleading message of zoos, and how do they react to that?
Generally, I suppose the question means, how do we... Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, sure, I can repeat it. How do you address people about the misleading message of zoos, and how do they react to it, if you inform them about that?
Yeah, it can, again, completely vary, but what we find is really important is getting the information out there, because there are obviously, as we've gone through, all these misconceptions, and that's why organisations like ours and Born Free and others do things like studying, well, actually how many animals in zoos are endangered and how many are actually making it out of zoos, because there is, how I like to describe it, the zoo industry has done fantastic marketing, and we have to try and do similar, and we are constantly accused of only approaching these issues from an emotional place. And yes, there's definitely emotion, and that's completely okay. There's the ethical side of it. You know, fundamentally we shouldn't be doing this to animals, regardless of any potential benefits that may exist to conservation or otherwise. But yeah, people want to see evidence, so we do things like investigate and show what happens to zoos. We try to basically counter each of those arguments that we've covered today, and the responses can be very different depending on who the person is. You know, I did do a talk at a vegan fair about should vegans go to zoos, because, you know, obviously, as I mentioned, we do sometimes come across vegans that, you know, have got really into the vegan issue and the things that happen to animals there, but they've got zoos in a different place in their mind. And the talk tried to look at the similarities. So the fact that zoos kill healthy animals because it's easier for them to manage the animals that way, or they're not the right genetics that they want for their program, or they've bred too many because they wanted lots of babies on display, or that, you know, the example I used of the pandas, they are artificially inseminating animals in zoos, you know, and we find that very abhorrent when we're talking about cows, for example. So trying to bring those similarities and to show that even though maybe the suffering isn't violent and graphic and really obvious, or that this is problematic.
Yeah.
I don't know if Liz might want to add some things. That was quite a long answer.
Yeah, we also have one more question for Liz. Maybe you can also.
Okay, yeah, sure, go ahead.
So first, thank you all for your fascinating talk. And then you spoke a lot about zoo animals. Do you make a distinction between zoo animals and companion animals?
Yeah, I think we definitely would. Just to add to what Nick was saying, I think the other thing plays back to what Blaine mentioned about confirmation bias. So the response to when we talk about zoos to people will be whether they're coming at us genuinely open to understand and kind of empathize with what we're saying, or whether it is kind of an attempt at a debate. And I think how open people are to what we're saying will really depend on that. Some people go away having sort of said, yeah, we feel like we've learned something new, and others will just kind of keep coming back with their own points. So defining between zoo animals and companion animals, absolutely. I think one of the main things is that animals in zoos are by definition wild, and that has different implications for them when we keep them in captivity. Now, we have selectively bred, rightly or wrongly, I'm not arguing the ethics of what we have done to get to the point where we have animals like dogs. I have 3 rescue dogs in my house here with me. They have been selectively bred over millennia, thousands and thousands of years, to be accustomed to living alongside human beings. And therefore, inherently, if they're well treated, there isn't as much of an argument that they suffer if everything else is balanced out, if they're well treated and their welfare is cared for. The argument with quote zoo animals or wild animals is that because they are hardwired to live in their natural environment and not in captivity, they will suffer automatically when they're held in a captive environment because it goes against their natural instincts. So that's, I know we're running out of time, so that's a very kind of broad brush view on it. We'd be happy to expand on that with the discussion in the other room if needed.
Yeah, perfect. I think, yeah, that's a good idea to, if some other questions are coming up, you feel free to go to the other stream and, yeah, chat some more there. Yeah, thank you very much for all your interesting arguments and your talks. And I don't know, Aga, do you want to add something in the end, or do you want to?
I would like to say thank you to the Olga team, actually. Thank you very much, because this must have been a massive challenge, and we are all really sad that we can't be there in person. But yeah, thank you very much. And I know that there have been quite a couple more, at least, questions that I saw that are quite urgent and quite yeah, which it would be nice to expand a little on. And we don't want to ignore anyone, so please do join us in the next room, and we can chat a little more.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so bye, and yeah, enjoy the conference.
Bye-bye.